The cardboard boxes lay scattered across the front lawn like discarded memories, my entire life reduced to damp piles under the afternoon sun. Clothes I'd worn to job interviews, books that had gotten me through college, photo frames holding moments that suddenly felt worthless. And there was Vivian, my stepmom, standing on the porch with her arms crossed and that smug smile I'd grown to despise. "My kids need your room," she announced like she was doing me a favor, her two teenage sons flanking her like backup dancers in this twisted performance. "You're 26 now. Time to figure it out." I stared at the woman who'd married my father 3 years ago and somehow convinced him I was the problem. The woman who'd slowly poisoned every family dinner, every holiday, every moment of peace in what used to be my home. But what Vivian didn't know was that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because sometimes, when people throw you out thinking you're worthless, they're actually just handing you the keys to their own destruction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The front door slammed behind me with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. I stood there on the concrete steps, keys still in my hand, staring at what had once been my sanctuary. My childhood bedroom furniture sat crooked on the grass like broken toys. The oak dresser my grandmother had given me for my 16th birthday was tilted against the mailbox, one drawer hanging open, spilling old journals and keepsakes onto the driveway. Vivian emerged from the house carrying another armload of my belongings, her perfectly manicured nails gripping a laundry basket filled with my professional wardrobe. The suits I'd saved for months to buy, the blouses I'd worn to networking events, the shoes that had carried me through job interviews and first days at new positions. She dumped them onto the growing pile with the same care she'd show taking out the trash. "Don't just stand there gaping," she said, not even looking at me as she brushed imaginary dust off her hands. "Start loading your car. I want this mess cleaned up before your father gets home." My father, the man who'd raised me alone for 15 years after my mother died. The man who'd taught me to change a tire, helped me with algebra homework, and cried harder than I did when I graduated college. The man who'd apparently agreed to this ambush while I was at work, earning the money I used to pay rent for the room I'd been living in since moving back home 8 months ago. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Where's Dad?" Vivian's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Caius is at the hardware store with my boys. They're picking out paint colors for Theron's new room. He's graduating next month, you know. Needs a proper space for a young man starting college." Theron. Her 19-year-old son who'd been living in the basement since she moved in, perfectly content with his gaming setup and mini fridge. The same Theron who'd never held a job, never paid a bill, never contributed anything to the household except dirty dishes and entitled demands for home-cooked meals. I looked at the chaos spread across the lawn and felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, something colder, more calculating. "You did all this while I was at work," I said. It wasn't a question. I did what needed to be done. Vivian adjusted her pearl necklace, a gesture I'd learned meant she was pleased with herself. "You're a grown woman, Serenity. It's time you learned to stand on your own feet instead of depending on family charity." Family charity. The words hit me like a slap. I'd been paying $800 a month for my old room, contributing to groceries, helping with utilities. I'd moved back home, not because I couldn't afford my own place, but because Dad had seemed lost after his hip surgery last year. Lonely. I'd wanted to help him adjust to life with his new wife and her 2 sons who'd moved in like occupying forces. "I pay rent," I said quietly. "You pay what we allowed you to pay," Vivian corrected, out of kindness. "But Alakrik needs his brother close by, and Theron deserves a room with windows and proper space. Your little nest egg should be more than enough for a security deposit somewhere else." My little nest egg, she had no idea what my finances looked like, what I'd been saving, what opportunities were opening up in my career. To her I was just the inconvenient stepdaughter who'd overstayed her welcome. Alakrik, her 17-year-old, poked his head out of the front door. "Mom, can you help me set up the PlayStation in my new room? The TV mount is being weird." "Of course, sweetheart." Her voice transformed, becoming warm and nurturing in a way it never was when she spoke to me. Serenity was just leaving anyway. I stood there as she disappeared back into the house, leaving me alone with the remnants of my life, scattered across the lawn like evidence of some crime I hadn't committed. The neighbors were starting to notice. Patterson from next door was pretending to water her already soaked petunias, while obviously watching the drama unfold. The Hendersons across the street had their curtains drawn, but I could see shadows moving behind the fabric. I thought about calling my father. I could picture him at Morrison Hardware, probably getting talked into buying more supplies than necessary while Theron and Alacric loaded up on overpriced energy drinks from the cooler by the register. He'd answer his phone with that slightly distracted voice he got when Vivian's boys were around, already anticipating their needs before they voiced them. But what would I say? That his wife had packed up my room like I was being evicted. That she'd humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood. That she'd turned our family home into a territorial battleground where I was clearly losing. No, I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of running to Daddy to fix this. I wouldn't give her another reason to roll her eyes and tell him how immature and dependent I was. Instead, I walked to my car and opened the trunk. Then I began the methodical process of loading my life into whatever space I could find. The boxes were heavier than they looked, cardboard soft from the humidity and threatening to split at the seams. My winter coats went in first, then the books I'd kept since high school. The photo albums my mother had made before she died, full of pictures Vivian had never bothered to look at. As I worked, I noticed things missing. My jewelry box wasn't among the items on the lawn, neither was the antique mirror my mother had left me, or the set of china we'd always used for special occasions. Small things but valuable. Things that had somehow failed to make it into Vivian's packing process. Looking for something. Vivian had returned, arms folded, watching me sort through the boxes with obvious impatience. My jewelry box, my mother's mirror. Oh, those. She waved a dismissive hand. Those are staying. They match the new decor so much better than your little teenage trinkets. Besides, Theron needs a proper mirror for getting ready in the mornings. My mother's mirror, the one with the silver frame that had sat on her vanity for 20 years before it came to me. The one where she'd taught me to braid my hair and apply lip gloss for my first school dance. Vivian was keeping it for her son to check his hair before classes he barely attended. Those belong to me. They belong to this house. Vivian corrected smoothly. Where they'll stay. You're welcome to visit them anytime, of course, once you're settled somewhere else. The condescension in her voice was thick enough to choke on. She spoke to me like I was a tenant whose lease had expired, not someone who'd grown up in this house, who'd helped Dad paint the kitchen cabinets and plant the rose bushes by the front porch. I closed the trunk of my car and turned to face her. For a moment we just looked at each other. She was waiting for me to cry, I realized, waiting for me to beg, or argue or give her some dramatic reaction she could use later when Dad asked why I'd stormed off in a huff. Instead I smiled, a small quiet thing that seemed to confuse her. Thank you, I said simply. Her eyebrows drew together. For what? For making this so much easier than it could have been. I got in my car, started the engine and backed out of the driveway without looking at the house again. In my rearview mirror I could see Vivian still standing on the lawn, arms crossed, probably wondering why I hadn't played my role in her drama the way she'd expected. She had no idea that she'd just given me the greatest gift possible. Freedom, from walking on eggshells every time I came home. From pretending her sons weren't spoiled and entitled. From watching my father slowly disappear under the weight of his new wife's demands and expectations. I drove to the extended stay hotel on Maple Street and paid for a week. Room 237 was small and impersonal, but it was mine. The bed was firm, the shower had excellent water pressure, and nobody was going to pack up my belongings and leave them on the curb. As I unpacked the boxes, I found myself thinking about Vivian's words. Your little nest egg should be more than enough for a security deposit somewhere else. She'd said it with such confidence, like she knew exactly what my financial situation looked like. She didn't know about the promotion I'd gotten last month. She didn't know about the signing bonus, or the raise that had nearly doubled my salary. She didn't know about the investment portfolio I'd been building, or the business plan I'd been developing with my mentor at work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She thought she knew me, thought she understood what I was capable of. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. 8 months later, I woke up in my downtown loft to the sound of coffee brewing and NPR's morning news filtering through speakers I'd installed throughout the open floor plan. The space was everything I'd dreamed of during those cramped years back home. Exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen island that doubled as my workspace when I brought projects home. The morning routine had become sacred. Coffee first, black with a touch of vanilla syrup. Then 15 minutes on the treadmill I'd positioned to face the window overlooking the city's financial district. The view reminded me every day of how far I'd come, how much my life had changed since that afternoon, when I'd loaded my belongings into garbage bags. My phone buzzed with notifications. 3 client emails, a text from my assistant about the presentation scheduled for this afternoon, and a LinkedIn message from a headhunter asking if I'd be interested in discussing exciting opportunities in the tech sector. I'd become something I never expected, sought after, valued, the kind of professional people wanted to recruit rather than dismiss. The investment consulting firm where I worked had given me autonomy I'd never imagined possible. My portfolio management had generated returns that impressed even the senior partners, and my client relationships were strong enough that people requested me specifically. Last month, I'd been featured in Financial Weekly as one of 30 under 30 rising stars in investment strategy. The article had run with a photo of me in my office, confident and successful in ways that the woman who'd been kicked out of her childhood home could never have envisioned. But the real transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. I'd learned to cook, really cook, not just reheat leftovers or assemble sandwiches. The kitchen had become my creative outlet after long days of number crunching and client meetings. Last weekend, I'd hosted a dinner party for 8, serving courses I'd planned and prepared entirely myself. My guests had been colleagues, neighbors, people I'd met through the running club I'd joined, or the wine tasting events I attended on Thursday evenings. None of them knew about Vivian. None of them knew about the stepmom who'd thrown my life onto the front lawn like unwanted furniture. They knew me as Serenity Damaris, the woman who'd built something impressive from the ground up, who lived in a space that reflected her success and ambition. The loft itself had become my sanctuary. Every piece of furniture was chosen deliberately, every decoration earned through my own hard work. The leather sofa where I spent Sunday mornings reading the Wall Street Journal. The dining table where I spread out financial reports and market analyses. The bedroom with blackout curtains and luxury linens that guaranteed perfect sleep before important meetings. I'd replaced everything I'd lost that day on the lawn, and then some. The jewelry collection was more sophisticated now, pieces I'd chosen for myself rather than inherited or gifted. The mirror in my bedroom was modern and elegant, reflecting not just my appearance, but the woman I'd become: independent, successful, completely self-sufficient. My savings account had grown beyond anything I'd thought possible. The signing bonus from my current position had been just the beginning. Client commissions, performance bonuses, and smart personal investments had built a financial foundation that gave me options I'd never had before. I could afford to be selective about opportunities, to turn down clients whose values didn't align with mine, to take calculated risks that had paid off spectacularly. But perhaps the most significant change was the silence. No more walking on eggshells, wondering if I'd somehow offended Vivian or her precious boys. No more listening to passive-aggressive comments about my career choices or living arrangements. No more pretending that her son's achievements deserved celebration while mine went unnoticed. The peace was profound. Some evenings I'd sit on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky over the city, and feel grateful for the solitude. The quiet apartment where my phone calls weren't interrupted, where my work wasn't dismissed as cute little projects, where my presence wasn't treated like an inconvenience to be managed. I'd made friends, real friends, not just people who tolerated me because of family connections. Elena from the office had become a trusted confidant, someone I could discuss both professional challenges and personal goals with. Marcus from the running club had introduced me to a whole network of active, ambitious people who planned weekend hiking trips and charity fundraisers. Dr. Patricia Wynn, my financial mentor, had become almost a mother figure, someone who celebrated my victories and offered wisdom during difficult decisions. These relationships were built on mutual respect and shared interests, not obligatory family ties or inherited loyalties. People sought out my company because they enjoyed it, not because they had to sit across from me at dinner tables or family gatherings. The business plan I'd been developing had evolved into something concrete. A consulting firm focused on helping young professionals navigate investment strategies and build long-term wealth. I'd already started working with a few clients on the side, friends of friends who'd heard about my success and wanted guidance with their own financial planning. The response had been encouraging enough that I'd begun seriously considering making the leap to entrepreneurship. My mentor had introduced me to potential business partners, successful women who'd built their own firms, and understood the challenges of establishing credibility in a male-dominated industry. We'd had preliminary discussions about office space, client acquisition strategies, and the regulatory requirements for starting an independent practice. But I wasn't rushing into anything. The stability of my current position had taught me the value of careful planning and strategic timing. I was building relationships, developing expertise, and accumulating the capital necessary to launch something substantial rather than just another small business struggling to find its footing. On weekends, I'd take long drives through neighborhoods I was considering for future investments. Real estate had become a passion project, something that combined my analytical skills with my instinct for recognizing potential. I'd started small, purchasing a duplex in an up-and-coming area, and renovating it into a rental property that now generated steady passive income. The financial independence was intoxicating. Not having to ask anyone's permission or opinion about major purchases. Not having to justify my choices or defend my priorities. Being able to help friends when they needed it, to donate to causes I cared about, to take spontaneous trips without worrying about budget constraints or other people's schedules. Last month, I'd spent a long weekend in Charleston, staying at a boutique hotel, and exploring the historic district at my own pace. I'd eaten at recommended restaurants, visited art galleries, and spent hours walking along the waterfront without having to coordinate with anyone else's preferences or limitations. The freedom was exhilarating. My father had tried calling several times over the months. I'd let most of the calls go to voicemail, listening to his increasingly confused messages asking why I wasn't responding, why I'd disappeared from family gatherings, why I wouldn't just work things out with Vivian, for the sake of keeping the peace. His messages revealed how completely he'd bought into his wife's version of events. According to Vivian, I'd thrown a tantrum and stormed off over a minor misunderstanding about room arrangements. She'd positioned herself as the reasonable adult, trying to manage a difficult family situation, while I was the immature stepdaughter who couldn't handle compromise. But I hadn't been compromising for years. I'd been accommodating, adapting, shrinking myself to fit into a family dynamic that had never really included me. Vivian had simply made the space so uncomfortable that leaving became the only viable option. Now, 8 months later, I could see that her cruel kindness had been exactly what I needed. Without her forcing me out, I might have stayed indefinitely, paying rent for a childhood bedroom, while my real life waited to begin. I might have continued accepting less than I deserved, both personally and professionally, because familiar discomfort felt safer than unknown possibilities. The woman who'd been humiliated on that front lawn was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more focused, completely clear about her own worth and unwilling to accept anything less than genuine respect. I had built a life that was entirely mine, and it was better than anything I could have imagined while living under Vivian's critical gaze. The first message came on a Tuesday morning, while I was reviewing quarterly reports for my biggest client. My phone buzzed with a notification I hadn't seen in months, a text from my father. "Serenity, we need to talk, please call me back." I stared at the screen, coffee growing cold in my hand. 8 months of silence, and now this. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the time that had passed, just an urgent demand for contact. I set the phone aside and returned to my spreadsheets. Whatever crisis had prompted this sudden outreach could wait until I finished my work. By lunch there were 3 more messages. "This is important. Family emergency. Call me as soon as you get this. Vivian says she's tried reaching you too." The last one made me laugh. Vivian trying to reach me was like a storm warning. Interesting to observe from a safe distance, but nothing I needed to engage with directly. I'd blocked her number months ago, after she'd sent a series of messages alternating between passive-aggressive guilt trips about abandoning family, and pointed observations about how my absence was causing your father stress. I finished my client presentation, scheduled follow-up meetings for the rest of the week, and took a long walk through the financial district. The late afternoon air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the streets buzzed with the energy of people building careers and lives that mattered. My phone buzzed intermittently in my purse, but I ignored it. That evening, I finally looked at the accumulated messages. 12 from my father, ranging from pleading to frustrated to desperate. 2 from numbers I didn't recognize, which I assumed were Vivian calling from different phones, and 1 from a contact I hadn't expected. Vivian's precious firstborn, the college student who'd needed my room so desperately, was apparently trying to reach me too. His message was shorter than the others, but somehow more unsettling. "Hey, it's Theron, can you call me back? It's about the house. The house. Our old family home, where Vivian had staged her dramatic renovation of my life. Where she'd claimed my mother's belongings, and redistributed my space to better accommodate her vision of family hierarchy. What could possibly be wrong with her perfect domestic arrangement?" I poured myself a glass of wine, and settled onto my sofa, city lights twinkling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The smart thing would be to delete all the messages and continue with my peaceful evening. I had a book I'd been meaning to finish, a bath I'd been looking forward to, and an early meeting tomorrow that required preparation. But curiosity has a way of overriding wisdom. I called my father back. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting by his phone like a sentry. "Serenity, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for days. I've been busy," I said simply. "What's the emergency?" "We need to see you. Can you come over tonight?" The desperation in his voice was unmistakable, but I'd learned to recognize manipulation disguised as urgency. Vivian was probably coaching him through this conversation, feeding him lines designed to pull me back into their drama. "I don't think that's necessary," I said. "Whatever this is about, we can discuss it over the phone. Serenity, please. I know you're angry about how things ended, but this is bigger than personal feelings. We're in trouble." Personal feelings. As if being thrown out of my childhood home was some minor emotional hiccup I should have gotten over by now. As if Vivian's systematic humiliation was just a disagreement about household management that reasonable adults could resolve with a conversation. "What kind of trouble?" I asked. There was a pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. "Vivian, undoubtedly, providing coaching for this performance." "Financial trouble," he said finally. "Serious financial trouble. We might lose the house." The house. The same house where my belongings had been unceremoniously dumped on the front lawn 8 months ago. The house where Theron now enjoyed his perfect room with windows and proper space. The house where my mother's mirror reflected Vivian's sons getting ready for their privileged lives. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and found that I genuinely was, not sorry enough to volunteer my help, but sorry in the way you feel when you hear about strangers facing difficulties that don't affect you directly. "Can you meet us tomorrow? At that coffee shop you used to like, Riverside Cafe? We can explain everything." Riverside Cafe, the place where my father and I used to have breakfast on Saturday mornings before Vivian arrived with her boys and their weekend soccer schedules and special dietary requirements. The place where he'd told me over coffee and blueberry pancakes that he was thinking about getting married again because he was lonely and Vivian made him feel young. "I don't think that's necessary," I repeated. "Serenity, please." His voice cracked slightly. "I know I haven't been the father you deserved lately. I know Vivian and you didn't always see eye to eye, but you're still my daughter, you're still family." Family. The word that had been used to justify every compromise I'd made, every slight I'd overlooked, every time I'd bitten my tongue when Vivian's boys received privileges and consideration that were never extended to me. "Family," I said slowly, "doesn't pack each other's belongings into garbage bags." That was a misunderstanding. Vivian was just trying to help Theron transition to college life. She never meant to hurt you. A misunderstanding. 8 months later, and this was still the official narrative. Vivian had simply misunderstood the appropriate way to discuss living arrangements with an adult stepdaughter. The humiliation, the neighborhood witnesses, the missing heirlooms, all just unfortunate miscommunication. "What exactly do you want from me?" I asked. Another pause. More background murmuring. "We want you to come home," he said finally. "We want to fix this family home," as if my downtown loft with its exposed brick and financial district views was just temporary housing until I came to my senses and returned to my proper place in Vivian's hierarchy. "I am home," I said quietly. "I have been for 8 months. Serenity." I hung up. My phone immediately began buzzing with callbacks, but I silenced it and carried my wine to the balcony. The city spread out below me, thousands of lights representing thousands of people living their own complicated lives. People who'd faced their own family dramas and professional challenges and personal setbacks, who'd learned to build something new when the old foundations crumbled. The phone stopped buzzing eventually, but the messages kept accumulating. I could see the notifications piling up like digital debris, each one presumably more urgent than the last. but I wasn't ready to engage with whatever crisis had suddenly made me valuable to them again. 8 months ago, I'd been expendable enough to throw away. Tonight I was apparently essential enough to harass with dozens of increasingly desperate messages. The irony was almost artistic. I finished my wine and went to bed, leaving the phone on silent. Whatever had happened to make them need me could wait until I decided I was interested in hearing about it. They'd had 8 months to figure out their lives without me. I could give them 8 hours to sit with the uncertainty of whether I'd respond at all. The next morning brought 17 new messages. My father Theron, 2 unknown numbers, and what appeared to be Alaric using someone else's phone to text me. The consistency was almost impressive. Whatever was happening, it had united Vivian's fractured family in their desperate need to contact the daughter they'd discarded. I got ready for work with my usual routine, but my mind kept drifting to the messages. Not because I felt guilty for ignoring them, but because I was genuinely curious about what could have gone so wrong in their perfectly arranged domestic situation. The financial trouble my father had mentioned could mean anything. Late credit card payments, unexpected medical bills, investment losses. Middle-class families faced financial stress all the time without it constituting a genuine emergency, but the involvement of both boys suggested something more significant. And the desperation in the messages implied consequences more serious than belt-tightening or temporary budget adjustments. By lunch I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to call them back. I wasn't going to meet them at Riverside Cafe for explanations and apologies and whatever manipulation Vivian had prepared for this reunion. Instead, I was going to find out exactly what kind of trouble they were in, because knowledge I'd learned was the most valuable form of power. I started with public records. One of the benefits of working in financial services was access to databases and research tools that most people never knew existed. Property records, liens, mortgage information, all of it available to licensed professionals who knew where to look and how to interpret what they found. What I discovered made me set down my coffee and read everything twice. The house, my childhood home, the place where Vivian had orchestrated my dramatic eviction, was 3 months behind on mortgage payments. Not just late fees or missed due dates, but seriously delinquent. The kind of behind that triggered foreclosure proceedings and legal notices. But that was just the beginning. I dug deeper, following the paper trail through county records and financial filings. My father had refinanced the house 18 months ago, taking out a significantly larger mortgage than what he'd originally owed. The new loan amount was nearly double the home's assessed value, which meant they'd borrowed against every bit of equity the property had accumulated over the decades my parents had owned it. The timing was interesting. 18 months ago would have been right around when Vivian's boys had started looking at colleges, when the family had begun talking about investments in their future and supporting the next generation's dreams. I called a contact at the mortgage company, someone I'd worked with on client refinancing projects. Professional courtesy went a long way in the financial industry, and she was able to provide additional details that painted an even clearer picture. The borrowers took a cash-out refinance, she explained. Substantial amount, but they've been struggling with payments almost from the beginning. The loan was probably too aggressive for their income level, even with both adults working. Both adults working. That was news to me. As far as I knew, Vivian had never held a job during her marriage to my father. She'd positioned herself as a full-time homemaker, too busy managing household affairs and supporting her son's academic and social development to pursue employment. I thanked my contact and continued researching. Social media provided its own revelations. Vivian's Facebook page, which I accessed through a professional networking account she wouldn't recognize, told a story of escalating financial stress disguised as lifestyle choices. 6 months ago, she'd been posting about Theron's exciting college plans and sharing photos from family dinners at expensive restaurants. 3 months ago, the post shifted to downsizing for simplicity and embracing minimalism. Last month she'd shared an article about the dignity of secondhand shopping and posted photos of a successful garage sale. But the most revealing discovery came from a different source entirely. Elena, my colleague who'd become a close friend, mentioned over lunch that her neighbor was dealing with a messy divorce involving hidden assets and secret spending. The wife had been using credit cards to fund her son's college expenses without telling her husband, Elena said. Private school tuition, luxury apartment deposits, spring break trips to Europe. By the time he found out, they were 6 figures in debt. The parallel was too obvious to ignore. I asked Elena for more details, and the story she told was like reading a script of my own family's drama. Stepmother prioritizes biological progeny over stepchildren. Father enables the behavior to keep peace. Financial reality eventually crashes through the fantasy. That evening I made some calls to people in my professional network who specialized in debt management and foreclosure prevention. The picture they painted was grimmer than I'd expected. When people refinance to fund lifestyle expenses, they're essentially gambling that their income will increase enough to handle the higher payments, one specialist explained. But college costs, especially for multiple offspring, tend to escalate faster than most family budgets can accommodate. Multiple offspring. Theron and Alaric, both enrolled in expensive private institutions, both requiring the kind of financial support that their mother's limited household management skills couldn't provide. I spent the weekend researching the colleges they attended. Prestigious schools with tuition rates that exceeded most people's annual salaries. Add room and board, books, technology fees, and the various expenses associated with maintaining social status among wealthy classmates, and the annual cost per student approached 6 figures. For 2 students simultaneously. No wonder they'd needed to refinance the house. No wonder my $800 in monthly rent had been so readily accepted. No wonder my departure had created a financial gap they couldn't fill. But there was more. I contacted a private investigator I'd worked with on client cases involving financial fraud. Within 48 hours she provided a comprehensive report that filled in the remaining gaps. Vivian had been working, but not in any capacity she'd admit to publicly. She'd been operating a small online business selling handmade crafts and vintage items, the kind of income that required careful tax reporting and business license registration. The earnings were modest but steady, probably enough to cover household expenses if managed carefully. But instead of budgeting conservatively, she'd been using the business income to justify increasingly expensive purchases for her sons. Private tutoring, designer clothing, technology upgrades, spring break trips, summer programs designed to enhance college applications. The credit card debt was staggering. Multiple cards, all nearly maxed out, with minimum payments that exceeded what most families spent on groceries. The kind of debt that made paying a mortgage impossible, especially when that mortgage had been inflated to cover previous spending sprees. My father, according to the investigator's findings, had been largely unaware of the extent of the financial damage until recently. His name was on the mortgage refinancing documents, but Vivian had handled most of the actual arrangements. She'd also been managing the household budget, which meant controlling information about income and expenses. Classic financial infidelity case, the investigator noted. One spouse accumulates debt while hiding the extent of the problem from the other. Usually ends in divorce or bankruptcy, sometimes both. The foreclosure timeline was accelerating. They had perhaps 6 weeks before the house would be sold at public auction. Not enough time to catch up on missed payments, even if they could suddenly access the necessary funds. Their only options were selling the house quickly in a private sale, declaring bankruptcy, or finding someone willing to pay off the existing mortgage and associated debts. Someone like a successful financial consultant with a substantial savings account and expertise in real estate investments. Someone like the stepdaughter they'd thrown away 8 months ago. I closed the investigation files and poured myself a glass of wine. The view from my balcony seemed particularly satisfying that evening. The city lights reflecting my own sense of clarity and control. They needed me. Not for my sparkling personality or my contribution to family harmony, but for my money. The same money they'd dismissed as a little nest egg when they'd packed my belongings into garbage bags. The same financial resources they'd assumed were inadequate for independent living. The irony was perfect. Vivian had created the very crisis that proved how wrong she'd been about my capabilities and worth. Her determination to prioritize her biological sons over her stepdaughter had led directly to a situation where the stepdaughter held the power to save or abandon them all. I thought about my father's voice on the phone, the crack of desperation when he'd called me family. I thought about Theron's text about the house, probably sent at his mother's urging when she realized her usual manipulation tactics weren't working. I thought about Vivian herself, forced to acknowledge that the burden she'd thrown away might be her family's only hope. But mostly I thought about choices. The choice I'd made to build something better after being discarded. The choices they'd made that led to financial ruin disguised as family investment. The choice I was about to make about whether their crisis constituted my emergency. The next morning I would decide exactly how I wanted to handle this unexpected reversal of fortune. But tonight I was simply going to enjoy the satisfaction of being sought after by people who'd once made me feel worthless. I woke up the next morning with absolute clarity about my situation. For the first time in 8 months, I held every card in a game that Vivian had been playing since the day she married my father. The woman who'd orchestrated my humiliation, who'd stolen my mother's belongings and distributed my living space to her entitled sons, was now dependent on my goodwill for her family's survival. The coffee tasted better that morning. The city view from my kitchen window seemed sharper, more vibrant. Even my morning workout felt energizing in a way it hadn't for weeks. Power, I realized, was an excellent motivator for productivity. My phone had accumulated another dozen messages overnight. My father's increasing desperation was evident in the progression from formal requests to barely coherent pleas. Theron had sent 3 more texts, each one more presumptuous than the last. And someone, probably Vivian using Alaric's phone, had tried calling at 2 in the morning, which suggested a level of panic that was almost delicious to contemplate. But I wasn't going to respond to their chaos with reactive decisions. 8 months of building a successful independent life had taught me the value of strategic thinking over emotional impulses. If I was going to engage with this situation, it would be on my terms, with my objectives, according to my timeline. I spent the morning at work, handling client meetings and portfolio reviews with unusual focus. My colleagues noticed the energy shift. Alina commented that I seemed particularly sharp during our strategy session, and my assistant asked if I'd had some kind of breakthrough with a difficult investment decision. The truth was simpler. For the first time since leaving my father's house, I felt like I was operating from a position of complete strength. The financial research I'd done over the weekend had revealed not just their desperation but the extent of my own power to shape the outcome of their crisis. I could save them. The mortgage debt, the credit card balances, the foreclosure timeline, all of it was manageable for someone with my resources and expertise. I could write a check that would solve their immediate problems and give them breathing room to restructure their finances. But the question wasn't whether I could help them. The question was whether I should, and if so, on what terms. During lunch, I took a walk through the business district and mentally outlined my options. Option 1: complete assistance. Pay off their debts, save the house, restore their financial stability without conditions. This would position me as the generous family member who'd risen above past conflicts to help in a crisis. It would also reinforce their belief that I existed primarily to solve problems they'd created through poor decisions. Option 2: conditional assistance. Offer help with strict terms about repayment, family dynamics, and my role in future decisions. This would establish my power while maintaining relationships, but it would also mean continued involvement in their drama and ongoing responsibility for their choices. Option 3: strategic acquisition. Allow the foreclosure to proceed, then purchase the house at auction for significantly less than the current mortgage balance. This would give me ownership of my childhood home while demonstrating the consequences of their treatment of me. Option 4: complete detachment. Let them handle their crisis without my involvement, maintaining the independence I'd built while avoiding any risk of being drawn back into their dysfunction. Each option had appeal, but as I considered the long-term implications, one possibility emerged as both personally satisfying and strategically sound. I wanted the house, not because I needed another property investment, although the real estate would be a solid addition to my portfolio. Not because I felt sentimental about my childhood home, although there was something poetic about owning the place where I'd been told I didn't belong. I wanted the house because it represented the ultimate reversal of everything Vivian had tried to establish about family hierarchy and my place in it. She'd used that house as a weapon against me, redistributing space and belongings to reinforce her son's priority over my comfort. Taking ownership would transform her weapon into my trophy. But I needed to handle this carefully. Direct confrontation would give them time to seek alternatives or negotiate with other potential buyers. Better to let the foreclosure process continue while positioning myself as the logical purchaser when the property went to auction. That afternoon, I called the real estate attorney who'd helped me with my previous investment purchases. We discussed the timeline for foreclosure auctions and the process for participating as a bidder. The legal requirements were straightforward and my financial qualifications were more than sufficient. Properties in foreclosure often sell for significantly less than market value, she explained. Especially when the existing mortgage exceeds current assessed value. You could potentially acquire this for 60 to 70% of what it would cost in a traditional sale. 60 to 70%, which meant I could own my childhood home for less than I'd paid for my downtown loft. The irony was almost too perfect. But timing would be crucial. I needed to maintain the appearance of family estrangement while secretly preparing for the auction. Any indication that I was planning to purchase the house might prompt them to find alternative solutions or alert other potential buyers to the opportunity. I spent the evening reviewing my financial portfolio and calculating the practical implications of the purchase. The house would require some updates to serve as a quality rental property, but the location was desirable and the long-term appreciation potential was solid. Even if I never lived there myself, it would generate steady income while providing the psychological satisfaction of controlling the space where Vivian had once held power over me. More importantly, owning the house would give me leverage over their living situation that mirrored what they'd once had over mine. The difference was that I'd use that leverage responsibly, legally, and with full transparency about terms and expectations. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. I would not respond to their messages or meet with them for explanations and negotiations. I would not offer financial assistance or family reconciliation. I would allow the foreclosure process to continue exactly as scheduled. And when the house went to auction in 5 weeks, I would be there with a cashier's check and a winning bid. But first, I needed to send one message to establish the terms of any future communication. I drafted a single text to my father. I'm aware of your situation. I'll consider helping after the legal process is complete. Don't contact me again until then. Short, professional, and deliberately ambiguous about what kind of help I might consider providing. It would buy me time to complete my preparations while keeping them focused on the foreclosure rather than seeking alternative solutions. His response came within minutes. Serenity, please, we can work this out together. Vivian realizes she made mistakes. We just need to talk. Vivian realizes she made mistakes. Not Vivian apologizes for throwing you out or Vivian wants to make amends for taking your mother's belongings. Just the vague acknowledgement that mistakes had been made without any specificity about what those mistakes were or how they might be corrected. I didn't reply. Instead, I called my real estate attorney and scheduled a meeting to finalize the paperwork for participating in the foreclosure auction. We would prepare bid documents, arrange for the necessary financial guarantees, and ensure that my purchase could be completed quickly and legally once I was the winning bidder. One question, she said as we reviewed the timeline. Do you want the current occupants to have advance notice that you're planning to bid? I thought about Vivian standing on the front porch 8 months ago, arms crossed, watching me load my belongings into garbage bags while her sons prepared to enjoy the space I was vacating. No, I said, I want it to be a surprise. The next 5 weeks would be the longest of their lives, wondering if they could find a solution to their financial crisis before losing everything they'd prioritized over treating me with basic respect. For me, those 5 weeks would be a countdown to justice. 3 weeks into my countdown to the auction, they showed up at my office. I was reviewing quarterly projections with Elena when my assistant buzzed through the intercom. Miss Damaris, there are some people here to see you. They say they're family, but they're not on your appointment calendar. Family. The word felt foreign in the context of my professional environment. My colleagues knew me as someone who'd built her success independently, without the safety net of family connections or inherited advantages. The idea that my personal drama might suddenly materialize in the sleek conference rooms and marble lobbies of my workplace felt like a violation of the boundaries I'd carefully maintained. Tell them I'm in meetings all afternoon, I said, not looking up from the spreadsheets on my laptop screen. I tried that. The older gentleman said he'd wait. He seems quite determined. Elena raised an eyebrow. Ex-boyfriend. Worse, I said, family. My assistant buzzed again. Miss Damaris, I'm sorry to interrupt, but they're asking if you could spare just 5 minutes. The gentleman mentioned something about an emergency. Of course they had. When manipulation through phone calls and messages failed, the next logical step was public pressure. Show up at my workplace, claim emergency status, and force a confrontation in an environment where I'd feel compelled to maintain professional composure. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'd expected from Vivian. If she couldn't reach me through guilt or family obligation, she'd use social embarrassment and professional concerns to create leverage. I'll handle this, I told Elena, closing my laptop. Can you reschedule the Patterson meeting for tomorrow morning? The elevator ride to the lobby felt longer than usual. I used the time to center myself, adjusting my blazer and checking my reflection in the polished steel doors. Whatever they'd planned for this ambush, I needed to appear completely unaffected by their presence. The lobby of our building was designed to impress clients and convey success. Floor-to-ceiling windows, modern artwork, leather seating arrangements that suggested both comfort and exclusivity. It was the kind of space that made visitors immediately aware they were in the presence of serious money and professional achievement. My father stood near the reception desk, looking smaller and older than I remembered. His hair had more gray, his shoulders seemed narrower, and his clothes hung loose in a way that suggested weight loss or stress. Beside him, Vivian wore a navy dress that I recognized from family photos taken years ago, back when she'd first married my father and needed to make good impressions. It was conservative, expensive, and slightly out of style, the kind of outfit someone wore when they needed to project respectability but couldn't afford current fashion. Theron slouched in one of the leather chairs, scrolling through his phone with the bored expression of someone who'd been dragged to an appointment he didn't want to attend. He'd grown taller since I'd last seen him, but the entitled posture was exactly the same. Serenity. My father stepped forward as I approached, relief and desperation competing for dominance in his expression. "Thank you for seeing us. I haven't agreed to see you," I corrected, keeping my voice low and professional. "I have 5 minutes before my next meeting. What do you want?" The bluntness seemed to catch him off guard. Vivian moved closer, her smile tight and calculated. "We want to talk," she said, as if this had been her idea rather than a desperate last resort. "About the situation with the house. About our family." Our family. The possessive pronoun was interesting, considering she'd spent 3 years making it clear that I wasn't really part of whatever family unit she was building with my father and her sons. "This isn't the appropriate venue for family discussions," I said. "If you want to schedule a meeting, you can call my assistant." "We've been trying to reach you for weeks," my father said, his voice carrying a note of accusation. "You won't return calls, you won't respond to messages. What were we supposed to do? What were they supposed to do?" The question was almost amusing. 8 months ago, when they'd decided my presence was inconvenient, they hadn't worried about my communication preferences or my availability for family discussions. They'd simply acted according to their priorities and left me to handle the consequences. "You were supposed to respect my boundaries," I said calmly. "The same way I respected yours when you made it clear I wasn't welcome in your home." Vivian's smile faltered slightly. "That was different. That was about space management and family logistics. This is about keeping our family together." Space management. Even now she couldn't acknowledge what she'd actually done. In her mind, throwing my belongings onto the lawn had been a reasonable solution to a practical problem, not a calculated humiliation designed to establish her son's priority over my comfort. "Your family," I said, emphasizing the possessive pronoun, "is not my responsibility." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Theron looked up from his phone for the first time, probably surprised to hear his mother's stepdaughter speaking with such directness. My father stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Serenity, I know you're angry. I know we handled things badly. But we're desperate here. We could lose everything." Everything. The same everything they'd been willing to risk when they decided my $800 in monthly rent was less valuable than giving Theron a room with windows. "I'm aware of your financial situation," I said. "I'm also aware that it's the result of choices you made without consulting me or considering how those choices might affect the family dynamics you're now asking me to help preserve." Vivian's composure cracked slightly. "We never asked you to pay for the boys' education. We never expected you to sacrifice for their future." "No," I agreed. "You just expected me to sacrifice my living situation so they could have better rooms while you borrowed against the house to fund their lifestyle." The accuracy of my assessment clearly surprised her. She'd probably assumed I was unaware of the financial details, that I'd been sitting in my downtown apartment nursing emotional wounds rather than researching the practical realities of their crisis. "How did you?" She started, then stopped herself. "I work in financial services," I reminded her. "I know how to research debt situations and foreclosure timelines. I also know how to calculate the cost of sending 2 students to expensive private colleges while maintaining a middle-class lifestyle." My father's shoulders sagged. "We made mistakes. We borrowed too much, spent too much. But those boys are bright, Serenity. They have potential. We wanted to give them opportunities." Opportunities. The same opportunities that had somehow never extended to me, despite my academic achievements and professional success. The same potential that had been nurtured with family resources while my contributions were dismissed as inadequate. "I'm sure they do have potential," I said. "The question is whether that potential is worth sacrificing your financial stability and family relationships to support. They're just starting their lives," Vivian said, her voice taking on a pleading tone I'd never heard before. "They need this foundation to build successful careers." Foundation. As if expensive tuition and luxury dormitories were the only possible basis for future success. As if the woman standing in front of them, who'd built a thriving career after being thrown out of her family home, hadn't proven that success was possible without inherited advantages. I built my foundation after you decided I didn't deserve one. I said quietly. They can do the same. The silence that followed was uncomfortable enough that other lobby visitors began to notice our conversation. Vivian glanced around nervously, probably realizing that her plan to use public pressure was backfiring. Can we go somewhere more private? She asked. Maybe your office. No, I said firmly. My office is for professional meetings. This conversation doesn't qualify. Theron finally spoke up. Look, we get it. You're mad about the room thing. But that was like 8 months ago. Can't we just move past it and figure out how to fix this mess? The room thing, my eviction from the family home, the public humiliation, the theft of my mother's belongings, all reduced to a minor inconvenience that I should have forgotten by now. There's nothing to fix, I said, looking directly at him. You wanted my room. You got it. You wanted independence from my financial contributions. You got that too. Now you want my help cleaning up the consequences of those choices. But wanting something doesn't mean you're entitled to receive it. My father tried a different approach. What would it take? What would we need to do to earn your help? Earn my help. The phrasing suggested he finally understood that my assistance wasn't automatic. That family obligation didn't override the history of how I'd been treated. Nothing, I said simply. There's nothing you can do. Everyone makes mistakes. Vivian said, her voice rising slightly. Everyone deserves a second chance. You can't just abandon family because of one disagreement. One disagreement. The systematic marginalization of my place in the family, the financial exploitation of my contributions, the theft of my inheritance, the public humiliation of my eviction, all condensed into a single disagreement that reasonable people should be able to resolve. I haven't abandoned anyone. I said calmly. I've simply stopped allowing you to treat me as expendable. The truth of the statement seemed to hit them simultaneously. My father's face crumpled slightly, as if he was finally understanding the extent of damage that had been done. Vivian's mouth opened and closed without producing words. Even Theron looked uncomfortable for the first time. The foreclosure auction is scheduled for next week. I continued. I assume you're aware of the timeline. We can't stop it. My father said quietly. We don't have the money to catch up on the payments. We don't have anywhere else to go. Nowhere else to go. The same situation I'd faced 8 months ago when my belongings were packed into garbage bags and I was told to figure out my own living arrangements. I'm sure you'll find something, I said, echoing the casual dismissal they'd offered when my housing became my own problem to solve. Serenity, please. Vivian said, all pretense finally stripped away. I know I handled things wrong. I know I was unfair to you, but we can fix this. We can be a real family. A real family. After 3 years of making it clear that I was a peripheral member at best, an inconvenience to be managed rather than a daughter to be valued, she was finally ready to offer authentic family membership. But the offer was 8 months too late and several $100,000 too convenient. I already have a family, I said, thinking of Elena and Marcus and Dr. Wynne and all the people who'd supported my success without expecting anything in return. I built it myself, with people who value my contributions rather than exploit them. I checked my watch, a gesture designed to emphasize that their crisis was not my priority. My meeting starts in 2 minutes, I said. You should probably leave before security asks you to move along. What happens now? My father asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now you experience the consequences of your choices. I said, the same way I did 8 months ago. I turned and walked toward the elevator, leaving them standing in the marble lobby with their desperate pleas and inadequate apologies. Behind me I could hear Vivian's voice rising, probably preparing another guilt-laden speech about family responsibility and forgiveness. But I didn't turn around. The elevator doors closed on that chapter of my life, carrying me back to the professional world I'd built where my value was recognized, my contributions were appreciated, and my boundaries were respected. Next week, I would attend a foreclosure auction, and finally, I would go home. The courthouse steps were buzzing with activity on auction day. Real estate investors clutched folders of property research, first-time homebuyers nervously reviewed their financing paperwork, and professional flippers calculated renovation costs on their smartphones. I sat in my car across the street, watching the crowd gather around the auctioneer's podium, waiting for the perfect moment to make my entrance. My childhood home was third on the auction list. 2 other foreclosed properties would be sold first, giving me time to observe the bidding process and assess the competition. Through my research, I'd learned that most foreclosure auctions attracted investors looking for quick profits rather than emotional buyers seeking dream homes. The atmosphere was businesslike, transactional, focused on numbers rather than sentiment. Perfect for my purposes. I'd spent the previous week finalizing every detail of my bid strategy. The cashier's check for the maximum amount I was willing to pay sat secure in my briefcase, along with backup financing documentation and the pre-approval letters my attorney had prepared. I'd calculated the property's current market value, researched comparable sales in the neighborhood, and determined that I could afford to bid significantly above what other investors might consider reasonable. Because for me, this wasn't just about real estate appreciation or rental income potential. This was about owning the very foundation of Vivian's power structure. The physical space where she'd once held authority over my living situation and family status. At exactly 10 o'clock, I stepped out of my car and walked toward the courthouse. My appearance was calculated to project confidence and financial capability. A charcoal business suit, minimal jewelry, designer briefcase, the kind of professional presentation that made auctioneers take notice and competitors recalculate their own bidding limits. The first 2 properties sold quickly to investors who'd clearly done their homework. Professional bidders who knew exactly what they were willing to pay, and stopped when the numbers exceeded their profit margins. The process was efficient, almost mechanical in its precision. Next property, the auctioneer called out, consulting his paperwork. 1247 Oakwood Drive, single-family residence, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, approximately 2,800 square feet. Property is being sold as is, with all existing liens and encumbrances. My childhood home, the address where I'd learned to ride a bicycle, where my mother had taught me to braid my hair, where my father had helped me with algebra homework at the kitchen table, where Vivian had decided I didn't belong, and packed my belongings into garbage bags. I moved closer to the front of the crowd, positioning myself where the auctioneer could see me clearly. Several other bidders were studying property information sheets, but their body language suggested casual interest rather than serious intent. The outstanding mortgage balance was higher than typical foreclosure properties, which meant the winning bid would need to exceed what most flippers considered profitable. "We'll start the bidding at $180,000, the auctioneer announced. The opening bid was significantly lower than what my father and Vivian owed on their mortgage, which explained their panic about the foreclosure. Even if someone bought the house at auction, the sale wouldn't generate enough money to pay off their debts. They'd lose their home, and still owe tens of thousands of dollars to various creditors. I have $180,000. Do I hear $185,000? A man in a baseball cap raised his hand. He looked like a contractor, probably calculating renovation costs and resale potential while he bid. $185,000. Do I hear $190,000? I waited. No need to engage early and drive up the bidding unnecessarily. Better to let the serious investors reveal themselves first, then outbid them decisively. $190,000 from the gentleman in the blue shirt. Do I hear $195,000? Another bidder joined the competition. Then another. The price climbed steadily but slowly, each increment representing careful calculation rather than emotional investment. $220,000. Do I hear $225,000? The bidding was approaching the range where casual investors would start dropping out. I could see hesitation in their faces, mental arithmetic calculating whether the potential profit justified the risk. $225,000. Do I hear $230,000? Silence. The crowd shifted restlessly, waiting to see if anyone would push the price higher. Going once at $225,000, I raised my hand. $240,000. I called out clearly. The sudden jump in bidding amount caused a stir in the crowd. Several people turned to look at me, probably wondering if I'd made a mistake, or if I knew something about the property they'd missed. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. Higher bids meant higher commissions. I have $240,000. Do I hear $245,000? The contractor in the baseball cap shook his head and stepped back from the crowd. One down. $245,000, came a voice from my left. I didn't hesitate. $260,000. Another murmur from the crowd. The bidding had jumped well above what most investors would consider reasonable for a foreclosure property in this neighborhood. $260,000. Do I hear $265,000? Silence. I could see the remaining bidders doing rapid calculations, probably trying to figure out how I'd arrived at such a high valuation. Going once at $260,000. $265,000. The voice from my left tried again. $280,000. I responded immediately. This time the crowd actually turned to stare. The bid was approaching fair market value for the property, which eliminated any profit margin for investors planning to renovate and resell. The remaining bidder shook his head and walked away. I have $280,000. Do I hear $285,000? The auctioneer scanned the crowd hopefully, but no hands went up. Going once at $280,000. Going twice at $280,000. I stood perfectly still, projecting the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Sold to bidder number 47 for $280,000. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that felt like punctuation on everything that had happened since I'd been forced to leave this property 8 months ago. I approached the registration table to complete the paperwork, writing out the cashier's check with steady hands while the auctioneer moved on to the next property. The administrative process was straightforward, designed to transfer ownership quickly and efficiently. Congratulations, the clerk said, stamping the final documents. You'll have full legal ownership within 48 hours once the paperwork is filed with the county. Full legal ownership. The house where I'd grown up, where Vivian had established her authority over my living arrangements, where her sons had been prioritized over my comfort and contribution, now belonged entirely to me. I was walking back to my car when I saw them. My father's pickup truck was parked at the far end of the courthouse parking lot, windows rolled down, 3 figures visible inside. They'd come to watch their home being sold to strangers, probably hoping against hope that the bidding would somehow stay low enough that they could find a way to buy it back. I could have walked directly to my car, avoiding the confrontation entirely. But something about the symmetry of the moment felt too perfect to waste. I changed direction and walked toward their truck. Vivian saw me first. Her face went through a rapid series of expressions: recognition, confusion, and finally dawning horror as she realized what my presence at the courthouse might mean. "Serenity," my father called out as I approached the driver's side window. "What are you doing here?" "I came to buy a house," I said simply. The silence that followed was profound. The Ron actually put down his phone, probably sensing that something significant was happening even if he didn't fully understand what. "You bought a house," Vivian repeated slowly, as if the words didn't make sense in the order I'd arranged them. "I did." "Which house?" my father asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. I pulled the auction paperwork from my briefcase and held it where they could see the property address clearly printed at the top. 1247 Oakwood Drive, I read aloud. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, sold to Serenity Damaris for $280,000. The impact was immediate and devastating. Vivian's face went completely white, as if all the blood had suddenly drained from her head. My father gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles stood out like mountain ridges. Even Theron seemed to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. "You bought our house," Vivian whispered. "I bought my house," I corrected. "The house where I grew up. The house where my mother lived. The house you decided I didn't deserve to live in anymore. But we're still living there," Theron said, his voice higher than usual. "Our stuff is still there. Not for long," I said calmly. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises, standard notice for new ownership transitions." The legal terminology felt precise and professional, exactly the kind of language they'd used when they'd decided my living arrangements needed to change. No emotional appeals, no family guilt trips, just clear statements about practical realities. "You can't do this," Vivian said, her voice gaining strength as shock gave way to anger. "You can't throw your own family out of their home." "I'm not throwing anyone out," I said. "I'm simply informing the current occupants that their tenancy is ending. The same way you informed me 8 months ago." "That was different," she said desperately. "You had options, you had money saved. We have nowhere to go." Options, money saved, the same resources she'd dismissed as inadequate when she'd decided my presence was inconvenient. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said, using the exact phrase she'd offered when my housing became my problem to solve. My father finally found his voice. "Serenity, please. We can work something out. We can pay rent. We can. The house isn't going to be available for rent, I interrupted. I have other plans for the property. Which was true. I'd already contacted a renovation contractor about updating the kitchen and bathrooms for future rental to carefully screen tenants. People who would appreciate the space and treat it with respect. What other plans? Vivian asked. That's not really your concern anymore, I said. Your concern should be finding new living arrangements before your 30 days expire. The reversal was complete. 8 months ago, I'd stood in this same driveway loading my belongings into my car while they watched from the front porch. Now they sat in their truck while I held the legal documents that gave me authority over their living situation. We raised you, my father said quietly. This house was your home. Was, I agreed. Past tense, you made it very clear that it wasn't my home anymore when you decided Theron needed my room more than I did. We made mistakes, Vivian said, tears starting to form in her eyes. We were trying to do what was best for the boys. We never meant to hurt you. Never meant to hurt me. As if the humiliation had been an accidental side effect rather than a deliberate demonstration of where I ranked in her family priorities. I'm sure your intentions were good, I said, but intentions don't change consequences. I folded the auction paperwork and placed it back in my briefcase. 30 days, I repeated. I'll have the official notice delivered tomorrow, but I wanted you to hear it from me first. I turned and walked back to my car, leaving them sitting in the courthouse parking lot with the reality of their new situation. Behind me, I could hear Vivian's voice rising in what sounded like the beginning of an argument with my father, probably about how this disaster could have been prevented. But their crisis management discussions were no longer my concern. I had a house to renovate and a family to evict. The same family that had once evicted me. 3 weeks after the auction, I stood in the empty living room of my childhood home, keys heavy in my hand, listening to the silence that only comes when a space has been completely cleared of other people's lives. The moving trucks had left that morning, carrying away the last remnants of Vivian's domestic empire, her decorative pillows, her family photos, her carefully curated vision of what our home should look like. My home now. The afternoon light streamed through windows that no longer had Vivian's heavy curtains blocking the view. Without her furniture crowding the space, the rooms felt larger, more open, full of possibility rather than tension. I walked slowly through each area, reacquainting myself with the bones of the house beneath all the cosmetic changes she'd made over the years. In the kitchen, scuff marks on the hardwood showed where her oversized dining table had sat, the one she'd bought to accommodate her vision of family dinners where her sons held court while I served as a peripheral audience member. The walls still bore faint outlines where her decorative plates had hung, the ones that had replaced my mother's watercolor paintings without discussion or consultation. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps echoing in the hallway that had once felt like a minefield of family politics. Past my father's bedroom, where he'd made the choice to prioritize his new wife's demands over his daughter's dignity. Past the bathroom that Vivian had redecorated in colors that matched her son's preferences rather than the home's original character. And finally to my old room. The space looked smaller than I remembered, probably because I'd spent the last 8 months living in a loft with soaring ceilings and expansive windows. But it also looked peaceful in a way it never had during Vivian's occupation. Theron's gaming setup was gone, along with his collection of energy drink cans and the sports posters that had covered walls where my artwork once hung. I stood in the center of the empty room and remembered the last time I'd been here as a resident. The frantic packing, the humiliation of having my belongings sorted and discarded according to someone else's priorities, the profound loneliness of realizing that the people who were supposed to love me had instead chosen to discard me. That woman felt like a stranger now. Someone I'd once been but had outgrown so completely that I could barely recall the mindset that had allowed others to treat me as expendable. From my purse, I pulled out a small wrapped package I'd been carrying since the day of the auction. Inside was something I'd purchased from an estate sale 3 months ago, a silver-framed mirror, vintage style, almost identical to the one my mother had owned and Vivian had claimed for Theron's grooming routine. I unwrapped it carefully and placed it on the built-in dresser where my mother's mirror had once sat. In its reflection, I saw not the uncertain young woman who'd been forced to leave this room, but someone who'd learned to build her own foundation, create her own success, and establish boundaries that protected her dignity. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was literally replacing what had been taken, but with something I'd chosen and purchased with money I'd earned through my own efforts. Not inherited, not gifted, not dependent on anyone else's approval or generosity. My phone buzzed with a text message. Elena, asking if I wanted to grab dinner and celebrate the successful property acquisition. I smiled, thinking about the life I'd built with people who valued my company rather than tolerated my presence. Friends who celebrated my victories instead of diminishing them, colleagues who respected my expertise instead of dismissing it. That evening I would go to dinner with Elena and probably tell her the full story of how I'd acquired this property. She'd listen with the kind of genuine interest that came from caring about my well-being rather than calculating how my experiences might benefit her own agenda. We'd drink wine and laugh about the poetic justice of it all, and she'd probably point out details about the situation that I hadn't fully appreciated yet. But first, I wanted to spend a few more minutes alone in this space, processing the complete transformation of my circumstances. 8 months ago, I'd driven away from this house with everything I owned packed into garbage bags, uncertain about where I'd live, or how I'd rebuild my life. Tonight, I owned not just this house but an entire portfolio of investments and opportunities. I'd gone from being someone whose contributions were dismissed to someone whose expertise was sought after. From someone whose presence was merely tolerated to someone whose company was genuinely. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been lonely evenings in that extended stay hotel, wondering if I was making the right choices. Difficult mornings when I'd questioned whether I was strong enough to build something new rather than simply accepting whatever scraps of belonging my family was willing to offer. But every challenge had taught me something valuable about my own capabilities. Every small success had built confidence for the next opportunity. Every boundary I'd maintained had reinforced my understanding of what I deserved from relationships, both personal and professional. I walked back downstairs and out to the front porch, the same spot where Vivian had stood 8 months ago with her arms crossed and her smug smile, watching me load my belongings into my car. Now I stood in her place, holding the keys that gave me authority over this space and everyone who wanted access to it. The neighborhood looked exactly the same, but my perspective had changed completely. Mrs. Patterson was still tending her perpetually overwatered petunias, probably wondering about the moving trucks she'd seen earlier. The Hendersons still had their curtains drawn, though I suspected they'd been watching the drama unfold with the same fascination they'd shown during my original eviction. Let them watch, let them see that the young woman they'd witnessed being humiliated had returned as the property owner. Let them draw their own conclusions about what kind of story they'd actually been observing. I thought about Vivian, probably spending her evening in some cramped apartment or temporary housing situation, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been entirely dependent on other people's resources. I thought about Theron and Alaric, learning for the first time that their comfort and opportunities weren't guaranteed simply because their mother had married someone willing to provide them. I thought about my father, who'd have to confront the reality that choosing his new wife's priorities over his daughter's dignity had cost him not just his relationship with me, but his home and financial stability as well. Their consequences weren't my responsibility to fix, any more than their choices had been mine to prevent. They'd created their situation through decisions that prioritized short-term comfort over long-term sustainability, appearance over authenticity, entitlement over earned achievement. I'd responded by building something better. As the sun set over the neighborhood where I'd grown up, I realized that this moment represented more than just personal vindication. It was proof of a principle that applied far beyond my specific circumstances, that people who treat you as disposable are usually revealing their own insecurities about their worth and capabilities. Vivian had needed to diminish me because my independence and success highlighted her own dependence and limitations. She'd thrown me out not because I was actually a burden, but because my presence reminded everyone, including herself, that she contributed very little of real value to our family's well-being. My father had allowed it to happen because confronting his wife's behavior would have required admitting that his second marriage was based on loneliness and fear rather than genuine partnership and shared values. Her sons had participated because they'd been raised to believe that other people's sacrifices were simply the cost of their own comfort. But their collective dysfunction had ultimately created the exact outcome they'd been trying to avoid. Instead of securing their position by removing me from it, they'd eliminated the one person who might have helped them navigate their financial crisis responsibly. The irony was perfect, but it was also instructive. This story isn't really about revenge, though I'll admit there's satisfaction in seeing justice served so poetically. It's about recognizing your own worth when others refuse to acknowledge it. It's about building something better rather than accepting something less. It's about understanding that being discarded by people who don't value you isn't a reflection of your inadequacy, it's an opportunity to find where you actually belong. If you've ever been made to feel like a burden, like your contributions don't matter, like your presence is merely tolerated rather than genuinely appreciated, remember this: their inability to see your value says nothing about your worth and everything about their limitations. You don't owe them your diminished self-esteem. You don't owe them your continued availability for their convenience. You don't owe them forgiveness that they haven't earned or reconciliation that serves their needs more than your well-being. You owe yourself the respect to walk away from situations that consistently undervalue you. You owe yourself the patience to build something better rather than accepting something less. You owe yourself the dignity to establish boundaries that protect your peace rather than preserve other people's comfort. And sometimes, if you're patient and strategic and willing to do the work of creating real value in the world, you'll find yourself holding the keys to the very spaces where you were once told you didn't belong. That's not revenge. That's justice. And justice, when it comes in its own time and through your own efforts, feels better than any apology they could offer. Your life lived fully on your terms, with people who celebrate rather than tolerate your presence, is the only response their treatment deserves. And their regret, when it comes, will be the confirmation that you were always worth more than they were capable of recognizing. Build something beautiful, own something meaningful, become someone undeniable. The rest takes care of itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.